It was a cold Monday morning in October when Sarah Johnson walked into courtroom 237 of the Franklin County Courthouse. The old building, with its marble floors and high ceilings, felt even colder than usual. Sarah, a 32-year-old single mother, straightened her borrowed navy blue suit and tried to keep her hands from shaking as she approached the defendant's table. Her court-appointed lawyer, David Miller, placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Stay calm," he whispered. "Remember, this is just a first-time offense. The evidence shows you only did this for Tommy's medical bills." Sarah nodded, thinking of her 12-year-old son fighting leukemia in the children's hospital across town. The bailiff's voice boomed through the courtroom. "All rise. The Honorable Judge William Sterling presiding." The door to the judge's chambers opened, and Judge Sterling walked in, his black robe flowing behind him. At 58, he was known throughout the state for his strict sentencing and what many called his old-school values. As everyone settled into their seats, Judge Sterling looked down at the case file on his desk. His eyes narrowed as they moved across the page. The weight of his stare made Sarah sink lower in her chair. The simple facts of the case lay before him. Sarah Johnson had created false insurance documents to get her son the cancer treatment he desperately needed. The total amount of fraud, $78,000. Case number 2024-CR 458, State versus Sarah Johnson, the court clerk announced. The charge is insurance fraud in the first degree. Judge Sterling's eyes moved from the file to Sarah's face, and his expression hardened. Sarah could feel his judgment before he even spoke. She had seen that look before, the same look she got when she walked into expensive stores or sat at nice restaurants with her son. The prosecutor, a young man named James Wilson, stood up first. "Your Honor, while the state acknowledges Ms. Johnson's clean prior record, we must emphasize the deliberate nature of this crime. The defendant knowingly created false documents over a period of 6 months." David Miller, Sarah's lawyer, quickly rose to her defense. "Your Honor, if I may, my client's actions were driven by desperate circumstances. Her son Tommy is battling aggressive leukemia. After losing her health insurance when her company downsized, she found herself with no options. She's not a criminal mastermind. She's a mother trying to save her child's life." Judge Sterling's face showed no emotion as he listened, but those who knew him well could see the slight tightening around his mouth, the way his fingers drummed silently on his desk, signs that he had already made up his mind. "Ms. Johnson," Judge Sterling's voice cut through the courtroom like ice, "please stand." Sarah rose on shaky legs. "Would you like to make a statement before this court?" Sarah cleared her throat, fighting back tears. "Yes, Your Honor. I know what I did was wrong. I'm not trying to excuse it. But when the doctors told me Tommy needed immediate treatment, and the insurance company denied our claims, I got desperate. I couldn't just watch my baby die. I worked 2 jobs, Your Honor. I tried everything legal first. I'm sorry for what I did, but I'm not sorry for trying to save my son." The courtroom fell silent. Even the usual shuffling of papers and whispered conversations ceased. Judge Sterling's expression darkened as he looked at Sarah. The way she stood there, head held high despite her tears, seemed to irritate him even more. "Ms. Johnson," he began, his voice dripping with disapproval, "this court has seen many defendants try to justify their crimes with emotional appeals. The fact remains that you orchestrated a sophisticated scheme to defraud an insurance company of $78,000. The fact that you used your child as an excuse makes this even more disturbing." Sarah's lawyer started to object, but Judge Sterling silenced him with a wave of his hand. The judge continued to study Sarah's face, his eyes moving from her brown skin to her carefully braided hair, down to her worn but clean shoes. Each glance seemed to reinforce something in his mind. "Before we proceed with sentencing," Judge Sterling announced, "I will review the case files in my chambers. Court is in recess for 1 hour." He stood abruptly, gathering his papers with sharp movements that betrayed his agitation. As the judge left the courtroom, Sarah sank back into her chair. She couldn't know that this brief recess would change not just her life, but would uncover a truth that would shake Judge Sterling's world to its very foundation. 1 hour later, Judge Sterling returned to the courtroom with a thick stack of papers in his hands. His face looked harder than before, as if the time in his chambers had only strengthened his resolve. The afternoon sun streaming through the tall windows cast harsh shadows across his features. Sarah's teenage son Tommy had arrived during the recess. Despite his weakness from chemotherapy, he insisted on being present. He sat in the front row, wearing a knit cap to cover his hair loss, his thin frame drowning in an oversized sweater. His grandmother, Mrs. Patricia Johnson, sat beside him, holding his trembling hand. "All rise," the bailiff called out. The sound of chairs scraping against the floor filled the room as everyone stood. Judge Sterling adjusted his reading glasses and cleared his throat. After careful consideration of the evidence presented, this court is ready to proceed with sentencing. He paused, looking directly at Sarah. "Ms. Johnson, please rise and face the court." Sarah stood slowly, her legs feeling like lead. Her lawyer, David Miller, stood beside her, already sensing something was terribly wrong. The tension in the courtroom was so thick it felt hard to breathe. "Ms. Johnson," Judge Sterling began, his voice carrying no trace of sympathy, "this court has reviewed your case extensively. While your defense has presented this as a simple case of a desperate mother, I see something far more sinister. You have demonstrated a calculated ability to deceive, to manipulate the system, and to exploit your child's illness for financial gain." Gasps echoed through the courtroom. Tommy started to cry softly, while his grandmother pulled him closer. Sarah's hands gripped the edge of the defense table so hard her knuckles turned white. "Your Honor," David Miller interjected, "with all due respect." Silence. Judge Sterling's voice cracked like a whip. "Mr. Miller, you will not interrupt this court." He shuffled his papers, pulling out a document with highlighted sections. "Ms. Johnson, your crime shows premeditation. You created false documents, forged signatures, and maintained this deception for months. This is not a simple case of theft. This is sophisticated fraud." The prosecutor, James Wilson, looked increasingly uncomfortable. Even he seemed surprised by the judge's harsh tone. He shuffled in his seat, avoiding eye contact with anyone in the room. "Furthermore," Judge Sterling continued, his voice rising, "you have shown no real remorse. Your emotional appeals about your son's condition are, in this court's opinion, nothing more than manipulation. You have used your child as a shield to justify criminal behavior." Sarah's voice came out as a whisper, "Please, Your Honor, my son." "Be quiet." Judge Sterling's fist came down hard on his desk, making everyone jump. "This court sentences you to 15 years for each count of fraud. With 7 documented instances of fraudulent claims, that amounts to 105 years in the state penitentiary." The courtroom erupted in chaos. Tommy screamed "Mom" and tried to run forward, but his grandmother held him back, her own face streaked with tears. Reporters who had been quietly taking notes suddenly jumped to their feet, shouting questions. Sarah's lawyer immediately began shouting "objection," while fumbling with his papers to begin an appeal. "Order! Order in this court!" Judge Sterling banged his gavel repeatedly, but the shockwaves of his sentence had already set off an unstoppable reaction. Sarah stood perfectly still in the middle of the chaos, as if frozen in time. Her eyes were fixed on Judge Sterling's face, searching for any sign of humanity, any indication that this was a horrible mistake. But all she saw was cold satisfaction in his eyes. The bailiffs moved forward to take Sarah into custody. As they approached with handcuffs, she finally spoke, her voice calm despite the tears running down her face. "I hope, Your Honor, that you never have to watch your child suffer and feel helpless to save them." As the bailiffs led her away, Sarah turned one last time to look at Tommy. "Stay strong, baby. Grandma will take care of you. I love you." Her voice cracked on the last words as she was pulled through the side door. Judge Sterling stood up quickly, gathering his papers. But before he could leave the bench, he'd heard Tommy's grandmother's voice ring out clear and strong. "God sees everything, Judge Sterling. Everything." The judge paused for just a moment, then hurried from the courtroom, unaware that his hasty exit was being captured by dozens of phones and cameras. By nightfall, the story of the 105-year sentence would be national news, and the first threads of a truth that would change everything were about to unravel. Marcus Bennett sat in his small law office, surrounded by stacks of case files and empty coffee cups. The veteran civil rights attorney hadn't slept properly in 3 days, not since he first saw the viral video of Sarah Johnson's sentencing. The 105-year sentence for insurance fraud had caught national attention, and his phone hadn't stopped ringing since. "This is what we've been waiting for, Linda," he said to his paralegal, who was organizing documents on the conference table. Look at Judge Sterling's sentencing history over the past 5 years. He spread out dozens of paper sheets, each showing different cases and their outcomes. Linda adjusted her glasses and leaned over the papers. I see the pattern, Mr. Bennett. White defendants with similar charges getting probation or minimal sentences, while black defendants. Her voice trailed off as she shook her head in disgust. Marcus grabbed another file, this one specifically about Sarah Johnson. Single mother, no prior record, works 2 jobs. Her son Tommy has stage 3 leukemia. The insurance company denied coverage due to a technicality. She created false documents to get him treatment. He rubbed his tired eyes. And Sterling gives her 105 years. It's not just wrong, it's personal. Something about this case got under his skin. The office door opened, and James Wilson, the prosecutor from Sarah's case, stepped in. He looked nervous, constantly adjusting his tie. Mr. Bennett, thank you for meeting with me. Marcus gestured to an empty chair. You took a risk coming here, Mr. Wilson. The DA's office won't be happy. James sat down, his face troubled. What happened in that courtroom wasn't justice. I recommended 5 years, mostly probation. Judge Sterling. He paused, collecting his thoughts. I'd never seen him like that. The way he looked at her was like he hated her personally. Linda brought over another stack of papers. We found 17 similar cases in the past year alone. Insurance fraud, all involving medical care. The sentencing disparities are shocking. Marcus spread out the new documents. White defendant, stole $100,000, got probation. White defendant, Medicare fraud $250,000, 3 years. But when the defendants are black. He pointed to case after case showing harsh sentences. James picked up one of the files. This isn't right. I've worked cases in Sterling's court for years. He's always been strict, but this, he shook his head. Something about Sarah Johnson triggered him. Marcus stood up and walked to his wall of case files. We need to dig deeper, not just into Sterling's cases, but into him. His background, his family, everything. He turned to Linda. Get me everything you can find about William Sterling's personal history. School records, family connections, property records. Everything. Linda nodded and started typing on her computer. After a few minutes, she called out, Mr. Bennett, look at this. Judge Sterling's father, Richard Sterling, owned several properties on the east side of town in the 1980s. A historically black neighborhood. Marcus moved to look at her screen. What was a wealthy white property owner doing there? Linda kept typing, her eyes scanning rapidly. There's more. Richard Sterling had several businesses in that area. And, wait. She clicked through several documents. There are some inconsistencies in his financial records from that period. Large cash withdrawals, unnamed payments. Marcus's eyes narrowed. James, you said Sterling seemed to hate Sarah personally. What if there's a connection we're not seeing? What if this goes beyond racial bias? James stood up, straightening his jacket. I should get back to the office, but he hesitated, then pulled out a USB drive. These are copies of Sarah Johnson's complete background check, things that weren't included in the court records. Maybe you'll find something useful. After James left, Marcus and Linda spent hours going through the new information. As midnight approached, Linda suddenly gasped, Mr. Bennett, Sarah Johnson's mother. She lived in one of Richard Sterling's properties in 1991, the same year Sarah was born. Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. Pull up Richard Sterling's travel records from that time if you can find them, and get me everything about Sarah's birth certificate, adoption records, everything. As Linda rushed to gather the information, Marcus stared at the photo of Sarah Johnson on his desk. There's something here, he muttered, something that could change everything. Little did he know, he was about to uncover a truth that would shake the foundations of Judge Sterling's world and change Sarah's fate forever. Marcus Bennett's hands trembled as he stared at the DNA test results on his desk. It was 3 a.m., and after weeks of investigation, the truth lay before him in black and white. The office was dark except for his desk lamp, casting long shadows across the walls covered in case files. This can't be real, he whispered to himself, double-checking the papers for the 10th time. The DNA comparison between Sarah Johnson and a sample from Judge Sterling's father's old medical records showed an unmistakable match. Richard Sterling was Sarah Johnson's biological father. Linda burst into the office, clutching more documents. Despite the late hour, she had been working at the courthouse, searching through old records. "Mr. Bennett, I found the sealed adoption records." She stopped when she saw his face. "What's wrong?" Marcus looked up, his eyes red from lack of sleep. Sarah Johnson isn't just another victim of Judge Sterling's racism. She's his half-sister. Richard Sterling had a relationship with Sarah's mother back in 1991. He got her pregnant, then paid her to keep quiet and put the baby up for adoption. Linda sank into a chair, the adoption papers falling from her hands. Oh my God, so when Judge Sterling sentenced her, he had no idea he was sending his own sister to prison for 105 years, Marcus finished. He picked up another document, a newspaper clipping from 1992. "Look at this. Richard Sterling died last year, but before that, he was making anonymous payments to Sarah's adoptive family for years. He kept track of her from a distance." The office phone rang, making them both jump. It was James Wilson, the prosecutor, calling from home. Marcus put him on speaker. "Bennett, I found something in the courthouse basement." James's voice crackled through the speaker. Richard Sterling's old divorce papers from 1995. His wife, Judge Sterling's mother, accused him of having other families. He denied everything, but she knew. Marcus spread out the new evidence on his desk. So Judge William Sterling grew up watching his parents' marriage fall apart because of these accusations. He probably thought they were lies. He paused, connecting the dots. And now, he sentenced the living proof of his father's infidelity to prison without even knowing it. Linda was scanning the adoption records. Sarah's birth mother tried to contact Richard Sterling many times over the years. She wanted Sarah to know her biological father. She looked up, her eyes wide. The last attempt was just 3 months before Richard died. Marcus started packing documents into his briefcase. "We need to file an emergency motion for appeal. This is a clear conflict of interest. Sterling should have never been allowed to judge this case if anyone had known about this connection." "And how do we handle this?" Linda asked, her voice concerned. "This information will destroy Judge Sterling's reputation his whole life. Everything he thought he knew about his family is a lie." Marcus walked to the window, looking out at the city lights. "Sterling's reputation isn't my concern. He spent years giving harsh sentences to black defendants. Now we know at least part of his bias might come from his own family trauma. But that doesn't excuse what he did to Sarah." He turned back to his desk and picked up a family photograph from Sarah's file. In it, she was smiling with her son Tommy at his 11th birthday party, before his cancer diagnosis. Next to it, he placed an old photograph of Richard Sterling that James had found. The resemblance between Sarah and her biological father was striking. "First thing tomorrow morning," Marcus announced, "we're going to the Judicial Review Board. Then we'll present this evidence to Judge Sterling himself." He started organizing the documents into clear plastic folders. DNA results, adoption records, payment histories, property records, everything. Linda helped him prepare the files. "He's going to be devastated." "Maybe," Marcus nodded, "but Sarah Johnson is sitting in a prison cell, separated from her sick child, because of his prejudice. And now we know that prejudice might have been eating at his own family all along." As they prepared to leave the office, Marcus took one last look at the DNA results. "Sometimes justice comes in strange ways," he said quietly. "Tomorrow, Judge William Sterling is going to learn that the woman he sentenced to 105 years in prison isn't just another defendant. She's the sister he never knew he had." The gravity of what was about to happen hung heavy in the air. In just a few hours, they would set in motion events that would not only change Sarah's fate, but would force Judge Sterling to confront his own biases in the most personal way possible. The Judicial Review Board meeting room felt smaller than usual that morning. Judge William Sterling sat at the long wooden table, surrounded by his fellow judges and legal officials. He had been called to an emergency session, but no one would tell them why. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Marcus Bennett stood at the front of the room, his evidence spread out before him. Linda sat quietly in the corner, taking notes. The head of the Judicial Review Board, Justice Maria Rodriguez spoke first. Judge Sterling, we've called you here today because Attorney Bennett has uncovered some disturbing information about the Sarah Johnson case. She nodded to Marcus to proceed. Marcus stepped forward, his voice steady. Your Honor, before I present this evidence, I want you to know that what you're about to learn will be shocking. It concerns not just Sarah Johnson, but your own family. Judge Sterling's face turned red. What does my family have to do with this criminal case? Instead of answering, Marcus placed the DNA test results on the table in front of Sterling. These are DNA comparison results between Sarah Johnson and your father, Richard Sterling. He paused as Sterling picked up the paper. They prove that Sarah Johnson is your biological half-sister. The color drained from Sterling's face. His hands began to shake as he stared at the document. This is impossible. This must be a mistake. It's not a mistake, Marcus continued, laying out more evidence. Your father had a relationship with Sarah's birth mother in 1991. Here are the adoption records, sealed until now. Here are records of payments your father made to support her secretly for years. Judge Sterling stood up suddenly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. This is preposterous. My father would never. His voice trailed off as he saw the old photographs Marcus placed before him, pictures showing the striking resemblance between Sarah and Richard Sterling. Justice Rodriguez spoke softly. William, please sit down. There's more. Marcus continued, his voice gentle but firm. Your Honor, the woman you sentenced to 105 years in prison is your sister, a sister your father kept secret from you. The same sister your mother might have suspected existed when she accused your father of having another family during their divorce. Sterling collapsed back into his chair, his face ashen. The other board members watched in silence as he picked up document after document, his hands trembling more with each page. All these years, Sterling whispered, more to himself than anyone else. All those accusations during the divorce. I always thought my mother was being paranoid. Linda handed Marcus another folder. Judge Sterling, these are records of your sentencing history over the past 5 years. The pattern shows significantly harsher sentences for black defendants, particularly in cases involving family matters. Sterling barely seemed to hear him. He was staring at a recent photo of Sarah with her son Tommy. She has his eyes, he said quietly. My father's eyes. I looked at her in that courtroom and felt such. He couldn't finish the sentence. Marcus leaned forward. Your Honor, is it possible that your anger toward Sarah Johnson wasn't just about the crime? Perhaps, unconsciously, you were punishing her for what her existence represented, your father's infidelity, your parents' painful divorce, the truth you didn't want to face. The room fell silent. Sterling's eyes filled with tears as he looked at more family photos. Pictures of Sarah growing up, school records, medical reports, all showing the life of a sister he never knew he had. Justice Rodriguez cleared her throat. Judge Sterling, given this clear conflict of interest and the personal nature of this situation, we have no choice but to vacate Sarah Johnson's sentence immediately. Sterling nodded slowly, still staring at the photos. I need to fix this, he said, his voice breaking. Not just Sarah's case, all of them, every case where I let my prejudice affect my judgment. Marcus gathered his documents. Your sister is still in county jail, waiting for transfer to state prison. You have the power to release her today. Sterling looked up, his face showing the weight of his realization. How do I face her? How do I tell her I'm sorry for what I've done? Start by signing these papers, Marcus said, placing release documents in front of him. Then maybe you can begin to understand why you really gave her that sentence. And perhaps, in time, both you and Sarah can heal from the wounds your father's secrets created. As Judge Sterling picked up his pen with a shaking hand, he knew his life would never be the same. The truth had shattered his world, but maybe, just maybe, it could lead to something better for both him and the sister he never knew he had. Judge William Sterling sat alone in his home office late that night, surrounded by case files from the past 5 years. He hadn't slept in 36 hours, not since discovering the truth about Sarah Johnson. His usually neat hair was messy, and his tie hung loose around his neck. On his desk sat an old photo album he hadn't opened in years. Inside were pictures of his father, Richard Sterling, always looking proud and proper in his expensive suits. You lied to all of us, William whispered to the photos. And I became exactly what you were, someone who hurt people because of their own pain. His phone kept ringing with calls from news reporters. The story had exploded across the nation. Racist judge discovers defendant is his half-sister. But William wasn't answering any calls. Instead, he was reviewing every single case where he had handed down a sentence. Linda, Marcus Bennett's paralegal, had dropped off boxes of statistics before leaving. The numbers were shocking even to them now. Black defendants in his court received sentences that were, on average, 3 times longer than white defendants for the same crimes. How did I not see it? He asked himself, pushing away from his desk and walking to his window. The city lights twinkled in the distance. Somewhere out there, Sarah was spending her first night of freedom with her son Tommy. The boy was having chemotherapy tomorrow, and this time, his mother would be there to hold his hand. William picked up Sarah's case file again. She had stolen $78,000 to save her son's life. Just last month, he had given probation to a white businessman who embezzled over $200,000 for a vacation home. His hands started shaking as he remembered his parents' divorce. He was 15 when his mother first accused his father of having other families. He remembered screaming at her, calling her jealous and crazy. He had defended his father so strongly, so blindly. Is that when it started? He wondered aloud. Did I begin hating people who reminded me of those accusations? He thought about how he had looked at Sarah in his courtroom, a black woman who represented everything he had tried to deny about his father. There was a knock at his door. It was Alice, his wife of 30 years. She carried a cup of tea and a concerned look. William, you need to rest. He shook his head. I can't. Look at this. He showed her a stack of cases. Every time I saw a black defendant, especially in family-related cases, I saw a threat to my perfect world. I saw the secrets my father kept, the lies he told, and I punished them for it. Alice set down the tea and picked up one of the files. What are you going to do? William stood up straighter, some of his old strength returning. I'm going to review every case, every single one, and where I find my bias affected the sentence, I'm going to recommend the cases for review. It won't be enough, but it's a start. He walked to his bookshelf and pulled out his judge's certification, framed and hanging proudly for 20 years. Tomorrow, I'm going to the judicial board. I'm going to admit everything. About my bias, about my father, about how I let my personal pain affect my judgment. They might take away your position, Alice said softly. They should, William replied. But before that happens, I want to use my authority to start fixing what I broke. He picked up a pen and started writing. I'm going to write a full confession. Every case where I showed bias, every time I let my prejudice affect justice. Then I'm going to work with Marcus Bennett to help overturn unfair sentences. Alice touched his shoulder gently. And Sarah? Will you try to know your sister? William's eyes filled with tears. How can I? I tried to destroy her life. I separated her from her sick child because I couldn't face the truth about my own father. He picked up the photo of Sarah and Tommy. But maybe, if she's willing, I can help make sure Tommy gets the best medical care. It's the least I can do. As the night grew deeper, William Sterling continued working. He wrote his confession, reviewed his cases, and faced the ugly truth about himself. For the first time in his life, he wasn't running from his father's secrets. He was facing them, and in doing so, beginning to understand how they had poisoned his own heart. Tomorrow would bring more challenges, more pain, and hopefully, the first steps toward healing. But for now, in the quiet of his office, Judge William Sterling was finally doing what he should have done years ago, looking in the mirror and seeing the truth. 3 months had passed since the truth about Sarah Johnson came to light. Judge William Sterling stood at a podium in the courthouse's main hall, facing a crowd of reporters, lawyers, and families affected by his past decisions. The room was packed, with people even standing along the walls. Today, Sterling began, his voice firm but humbled, I am announcing the completion of our case review project. He held up a thick report. We have identified 247 cases where my racial bias directly affected sentencing. Each of these cases will be reopened and reviewed by an independent panel of judges. Marcus Bennett sat in the front row, nodding approvingly. Next to him was Linda, taking notes as always. They had worked tirelessly with Sterling over the past months, reviewing every case, every decision. I cannot undo the pain I have caused, Sterling continued, gripping the podium tightly. Some of the people I sentenced unfairly spent years away from their families. Children grew up without parents. Parents missed births, graduations, and precious moments they can never get back. In the middle of the crowd sat Sarah Johnson, now free, with Tommy beside her. The boy looked healthier, his cancer responding well to the treatments he was now receiving at the state's best hospital, anonymously paid for by his newly discovered uncle. My own story is not what matters here, Sterling said, looking directly at Sarah. But understanding why I acted with such bias has helped me see how deep prejudice can run. My father's secrets, my own buried pain. These things poison my judgment, but they do not excuse it. He pulled out another document. Today, I am submitting my resignation from the bench. A murmur ran through the crowd. But before I step down, I have established the Sterling Justice Reform Foundation, funded by the sale of all my family's properties and investments. Sarah straightened in her seat, her eyes fixed on her half-brother. She hadn't spoken to him directly yet, but she had been watching his actions closely over the past months. This foundation will do 3 things, Sterling explained. First, it will provide legal support to appeal unfair sentences, focusing on cases where racial bias played a role. Second, it will fund programs to help judges recognize and overcome their own biases. And third, it will support families affected by the criminal justice system, especially children with medical needs. Tommy grabbed his mother's hand and squeezed it. His last 3 chemotherapy treatments have been completely covered by the foundation's first grant. Sterling stepped away from the podium and did something unexpected. He walked down to where Sarah was sitting and knelt before her. The room fell silent. Sarah, his voice cracked with emotion, I know I have no right to ask for your forgiveness. What I did to you was unforgivable, but your case didn't just expose my prejudice. It showed me I had a sister. A brave, loving mother who would do anything to save her child. Just like our father kept you a secret, I kept my own hatred a secret, even from myself. Sarah's eyes filled with tears, but she remained composed. Tommy looked between his mother and his uncle, squeezing her hand tighter. The foundation's board will be led by Marcus Bennett, Sterling continued, speaking to both Sarah and the crowd. And I want to offer you a position on it, Sarah. Your voice, your experience, could help prevent other families from suffering as yours did. Sarah took a deep breath. The room waited in tense silence. Finally, she spoke, her voice clear and strong. I accept. Not for you, but for every other person who faced injustice in your courtroom. And for Tommy, so he can see that change is possible. Sterling nodded, tears in his eyes. He stood up and returned to the podium. My final act as a judge will be to formalize the overturning of these unjust sentences. Then I will step down, and the real work begins. As the press conference ended, people began to approach Sarah, wanting to hear her story. Sterling watched from a distance as his sister handled the attention with grace and dignity. He knew he had a long way to go to earn her trust, but today was a start. Marcus Bennett approached him. You did good, William. Now the hard part begins. Sterling nodded, watching as Tommy hugged his mother. Yes, the hard part. Making sure no other judge lets their personal demons destroy innocent lives like I almost destroyed my own sister's. 1 year had passed since the Foundation's creation. The Sterling Justice Reform Foundation's office buzzed with activity as Sarah Johnson walked through the doors, carrying a stack of new case files. Her office, with its view of the city park, had pictures of Tommy covering one wall, a timeline of his recovery from leukemia. The latest photo showed Tommy at his school graduation, cancer-free and beaming. Next to it was a newspaper clipping with the headline, Reform Foundation helps 100th family win appeal against biased sentencing. Sarah sat at her desk, reviewing applications from families seeking help, when her assistant knocked. Your brother is here for the monthly board meeting. She took a deep breath. After a year, it was still strange to think of William Sterling as her brother. Their relationship had grown slowly, carefully, like a fragile plant pushing through concrete. William entered, looking different from his judge days. No more expensive suits. He wore simple business casual clothes now. The arrogance was gone from his face, replaced by a quieter, more thoughtful expression. Sarah, he said softly, Tommy's graduation pictures came out beautifully. He gestured to the wall of photos. Yes, she replied, The doctors say he's completely cured now. She paused, then added, "Thank you, William, for making sure he got the best treatment." William shook his head. "Don't thank me. It should have been his right from the beginning." He sat down across from her desk. "How's the Anderson case going?" Sarah pulled out a file. Another judge gave a black father 8 years for stealing medicine for his daughter's asthma. White defendant last month got probation for stealing twice as much. She looked up at William. "Remind you of anyone?" He winced but nodded. "Yes, too much. Marcus and the legal team started the appeal." "Filed yesterday," Sarah confirmed. "But that's not why I called you here early." She pulled out an old photo album she brought from home. "I found these in my adoptive mother's attic. Pictures of our father with my birth mother." William's hands trembled slightly as Sarah opened the album. There was Richard Sterling, their father, young and smiling, with his arm around a beautiful black woman. They looked happy, in love even. "He loved her," Sarah said quietly. "These letters show it. He wanted to leave your mother for her, but he was a coward," William finished. "He chose his reputation over love. Over you." He looked at his sister. "Just like I chose my prejudice over justice. We Sterling men seem to make the wrong choices." Sarah stood up and walked to her wall of photos. "Look at this." She pointed to a recent picture. It showed Tommy's birthday party. William was there, along with Marcus Bennett, Linda, and several families they'd helped through the foundation. "This is what making the right choice looks like." William joined her at the wall. "Sarah, I know I can never fully make up for what I did to you." "No, you can't," she agreed. "But that's not what this is about anymore." She turned to face him. "This foundation has helped hundreds of families. Children are with their parents tonight because of what we built from your mistake. That matters." Just then, Tommy burst into the office, now a healthy, tall teenager. "Mom, Uncle Will. Everyone's waiting in the conference room. Marcus says we have big news." They followed Tommy to the large conference room, where Marcus Bennett stood with Linda and the other board members. A projection screen showed their latest victory. The state Supreme Court had just mandated bias training for all judges based on the Foundation's research and recommendations. "This is just the beginning," Marcus announced proudly. "They're looking to implement our program nationwide." Sarah felt William's eyes on her and turned to look at him. For a moment, they weren't a former judge and his victim, or even the children of Richard Sterling's complicated choices. They were just a brother and sister who had found a way to turn pain into purpose. "We have our father's blood," Sarah said quietly to William. "We chose a different path." William nodded, watching as Tommy excitedly talked with Marcus about the Supreme Court decision. "You know," he said, "I think I finally understand what Dad should have done all those years ago." "What's that?" Sarah asked. "Choose love over fear. Choose truth over reputation." He looked at his sister. "Choose family over prejudice." Sarah smiled, a real smile that reached her eyes. "Better late than never, brother. Better late than never." As the room filled with chatter and celebration, Sarah Johnson and William Sterling stood side by side, two halves of a truth that had finally come to light. Their story wasn't just about racism or redemption anymore. It was about how the hardest truths, faced honestly, could heal not just one family, but an entire system.